All right, we are going to be learning about what it means to have an ecological footprint today. And then tomorrow we're actually going to start calculating it. So I've got a little poem to start off with you. It's called Ecological Footprint. It says, millennia ago, monstrous creatures, taller than steely skyscrapes, strolled the landscape, ripped and roared through rank primeval forests, leaving large footprints indelibly embossed in fossil clay. Fast forward to today. Mankind meanders on his merry way and leaves his footprints plain across the planet's face. In every nook and cranny of the worried world he plants his evil presence. Time will not erase the loathsome harm he lightly visits on his mother's face. His putrid presence builds into a bold disgrace. Soon the earth, like a spent ember, will fizzle out, trampled to sterile ash by meddlesome man, no doubt. And there will be no healing rain to wash these footprints out. Very sad poem here. Definitely not happy-go-lucky like we would wish. But when we talk about ecological footprints, often it's not a happy story. Ecological footprints tell us how much of an impact we have on the earth. And especially because of our culture, or the American culture, we often have a larger footprint than we might notice, because a lot of our habits aren't very environmentally friendly. So today we're going to discover what an ecological footprint is, and tomorrow we're going to calculate yours. And then my hope is that by learning your ecological footprint, you will be able to take something from it and maybe make your footprint a little bit less. And with the poem, these monstrous creatures, by the way, might have been dinosaurs. That's what I read it in, but I also really like dinosaurs, so maybe that's it. And their footprints were just simply their footprints, but our footprints are much more than that. They're the amount of resources that we use. They're the trash that we produce. They are the way that we vote and the way that we make decisions about our lives. And they have a much more greater impact maybe than those of the ancient large dinosaurs. And we are going to keep skipping through that. Those were our questions we just went through. And the last line was very heavy, or very kind of wow, like a sucker punch, almost to the gut. But it says, and there will be no healing rain to wash these footprints out. That means that it's simply not going to be a rain that takes away the negative impacts of humans from the earth, like maybe the ancient animals, the footprints of the ancient animals. It's going to take a lot more to heal the earth. But before we get to our ecological footprints, we depend on nature. So we exchange energy and matter with our environment as we eat, drink, and breathe. We use energy for heat and mobility. We use wood for housing and paper, and we use food for water, or we use food and water for living. We do a lot more than that as well. Excuse me. All of the things that we use and come in contact with every day are natural resources, whether they be like the oil that powers our car, the gasoline that powers our car, or simply the wood that our table is built out of, or the steel beams that hold up our houses and roofs. We depend on nature. Nature, more than that though, absorbs our waste. So nature naturally filters out the pollutions that we have. The problem is that we're polluting so much that nature can't do that. Nature provides climate stability, so as we do things like let out a lot of carbon dioxide from our cars, our trees and green things use that carbon dioxide to do photosynthesis and grow. But again, the problem is that we're producing too much carbon dioxide, just like we talked about in our climate change unit. And the trees and green things can't take in all that carbon dioxide, so we have an excess in the environment. And nature also protects us from the ultraviolet radiation. We learned in our climate change unit that is actually the good ozone, or the O3 molecules, that do that for us. In our cities, we tend to think of nature as a collection of commodities we obtain from around the world, but nature is the very source of our lives and well-being, so it is important that we are paying attention to the natural world around us and our impact that we have on it. As we talked about human population growth the other day, we learned that human population has a limit of how much they can grow, and a lot of that has to do with nature. The more that nature can absorb the negative impacts of humanity, the longer the human population can grow and the larger a population can get. But once nature can no longer deal with the negative impacts, or we start seeing some serious issues, the closer we'll come to our limits. Not only that, but we can only grow so much corn to feed people. So nature definitely provides our limits for human population growth. Ecological footprint, or the whole purpose of today, is the amount of ecologically productive land used by individuals, cities, and countries, etc. So I could find my ecological footprint, and that's what you're going to do tomorrow. We could find it for your city, we could find it for our country, and oftentimes we find that different countries have different ecological footprints. Some are a lot better, some are not. Production and use of goods and services involve land use. They have an ecological footprint. They are made up of several parts. The very first part is our energy land, or so how much land do we use to power things like our cars, or even just our houses as well. Maybe my laptop that I'm using right now, how much energy do I need for that? How much land must be altered for me to get that energy I need? Consumed land, or the land that I've built upon, like for my house, and we learned that this is limited. And so we started doing things like building up. Skyscrapers are awesome because they can house a lot of people instead of spreading them out into a wide variety of places. It's actually better for the environment to live in a shared housing, like a condo or an apartment, than to live in a single standing house. Farmland, how much food do we take in and what kind of food? That's very specific. Forest land, so how much of our forest products do we use, like paper or wood for building houses? And back to farmland, by the way, it's not just food, and it's somewhere in between forest land and farmland are things like cotton that we use for clothing. Transportation footprint, and this gets a lot of us as Americans. We don't often carpool. Everybody has their own car, so we generally have huge transportation footprints. If one person travels 3 miles twice each workday, the following amount of space would be needed for roads. If they have a bike, they're going to use 122 square meters. If they have a bus, then they use 301 square meters, and if they have a car, they use 1,442 square meters of road. So we're not even just talking about the energy used for this, but we're talking about the amount of road space that we actually need for our cars and buses to run, and bicycles to run as well. And by the way, you should be writing the main point of each of these, like what's in the title. So products for economy, transportation footprint, this one you're going to have to say the definition here, so the amount of space we would need for a person to travel on, like the road space. Agriculture footprint, so open field production of tomatoes takes up more land than greenhouse production, but greenhouse production has a much larger ecological footprint because it's less natural, it needs a lot of energy, fertilizer, and other outputs. So how much energy or how much land is it taking for us to build or to grow our food? Urban footprints. So imagine if New York City was covered by a bubble. Most people would die within a few days. Cities depend on much greater amounts of land and environment for vitality, meaning that I am not growing all of the corn that New York City needs to be able to survive and live and eat in New York City. Absolutely not. If you've ever been to New York City, there's no farmland in New York City. That means they're getting it from somewhere else. Many of our urban footprints are actually a lot larger than what you would think, because they need a lot more land than what they actually have inside the city limits to help sustain themselves. Many of our cities are like that. That's why the rural areas, like where you live in Bladen County, or Columbus County, or Sampson County, or Robeson County, is so important, because those rural lands actually provide the food and resources that our big urban cities need. Urban footprints. Now imagine how big that bubble would have to be for New York City to be self-sustaining. It would be about the size of Oklahoma and Texas combined. So if I had New York City and all the people that lived in New York City, and I wanted to show you how much land use it takes up, whether that be for food or oil or just natural resources, it would take the size of Texas and Oklahoma to support the population living inside New York City, which is crazy. What areas of your life negatively affect your ecological footprint? So that's just something to kind of think about and meditate on. Or where do you think you're spending the most land, quote unquote? I think in my own life, it's definitely transportation. I drive my car a lot, and generally it's just me and my car. So I spend a lot of time on the road. So there's a lot of land use on a road for me. But not only that, there's a lot of land use in the gasoline I have to put in my car. I have a pretty good miles per gallon car, meaning that it runs pretty well on the gas that I put in it. But if I go somewhere on the weekend, I need to fill up my car every week. Like this past weekend, I didn't go anywhere. I stayed local. Like I didn't go visit my parents in Leland or anything, so I didn't need to fill up my car. But usually I have to fill it up every week. This week, it just happened I could make it 2 weeks. So what area of your life do you think you could alter to make your ecological footprint go down a little bit? So each nation has a different footprint. For example, Holland has a population of 150 million people, and it's got a pretty decent density of people, meaning that they live in places like cities, but their consumption is less than the United States. Still, Dutch people require 15 times more land than is within their country for food, forest products, and energy use. That means that the ecosystems that support Holland, whether that be for energy or food or forest products, lie far beyond their nation's borders, so they actually have to import a lot of their natural resources that they need. In the US, each person uses about 11 acres of land. Worldwide, the average is about 3.7 acres. Therefore, if everybody were to adopt the US consumption style, we would need 4 to 5 planets to support the people on the earth. What that means for you and me is that we as Americans generally have a lot of practices in our life that are not very environmentally friendly. We're using more, or we're using more than we need, or we're being wasteful in some ways. And it's important in your lives to kind of look at where you're being wasteful, because a lot of the times when you're wasteful, you lose money. So you're saving money, but also it can lead to saving some the environment as well. So 2-for-1 deal right there. Here is just a chart. So this would be the number of planets we would need if the whole world lived like each nation. If it was something like China, we would need about 1 in a little sliver of the earth, or India, we'd only need half of the earth. That means that people in India generally have a better consumption rate than the people in the US. Like I said, it would take 5 planets to support the people if we lived like we do on the US. The closest country to us is Spain, but there's still a whole planet and a half away from us, meaning that we've got a lot to learn and a large area of growth here. So why do you think the US land average usage is so high compared to other countries? One of the things that we see is that we are very, very wasteful, like I said, or we tend to have more wasteful lifestyles. We use a lot of plastic containers and bags, and a lot of things are put in plastic that maybe don't have to be in plastic. Not only that, again, the transportation, like if you go to Europe or anywhere, you've got a lot of public transportation. We just don't have that in the world. So why do we not need a bunch of worlds? Why aren't we already seeing big issues? A lot of that is because other nations don't live like us. More nations are much more conscious, or simply they don't have the ability to get what we have. There's a large inequity. So we all compete for an ecologically overloaded world. Excess consumption by well-off countries takes up the ecological footprint that would be used by poorer nations. So our poorer nations generally don't have as large of an ecological footprint because they simply just don't have as much as us, or they don't have access to it. And that balances out, which is a great thing. But again, it's an inequity, or we have an unequal balance of resources. Here's an example of a photography kind of lesson, and it shows the weekly food shop for average families in different places. So this one is Germany. They spend about $500. This is the US. They spend about $346 per week. And you can pause this and look at the kind of things that they eat in Germany versus the United States. Yes, it's more expensive, but we've got a lot different food here. And here is a country like Chad, or one of our third world countries, and they spend $1.62 on groceries or food supplies per week for a family. Resource distribution is a large reason why we have this versus this. Generally, our wealthiest population, or 25%, use about 75% of the world's resources. That means that the people who have the most money are using the most of our resources. If 4 people landed on an island, they could divide the land up into 4 equal sections and trade goods. Is it fair for one of those people to claim 3/4 of the land